You're listening to the Physio Matters podcast in association this month with IPRS Health, and this is session 52. Welcome back to Physio Matters. I'm Jack Chew and I hope you're doing well. I also hope that you've had the sense to sign up for the Physio Research Society Conference, 19th of April. So many people getting in touch after the last episode where we were wanting to find out more about the details of the references that we were talking about. Of course, they ended up on the Google Drive page only days after release, and so you got fed your monthly dose from us of the hard evidence. But then questions we get about research, there's clearly a massive thirst for understanding these things in more detail, and the Physio Research Society are the best in the business for that. Really open discussions about not just evidence but how to integrate it into practice, and that's exactly the core of what they're doing at their next conference, 19th of April. Now listen to this, if you're a student, it's £30 at Northumbria University for a full day's worth. And I mean, you look at the speakers, it's non-members 75, which is still ridiculous. You've got Professor Nicola Adams, Professor Nadine Foster, Professor Lynn Rochester, and then you've got the likes of Devdeep Ahuja and Ben Drew and Dr. Rachel Chester. I mean, especially after last year, I went along for the first time, and it just blew me away. I was just in awe, just especially of the conversation, the quality of the conversation, the openness, the inclusivity of trying to integrate different ideas and different people into research is just mega. So amazed at the amount of people that I've then asked when they've asked about research and stuff, and then I say, well, I assume you're going to the PRS, and I was thinking about it. It's like, I just don't understand how you'd be torn over this. physioresearch.org, get yourself signed up and get yourself there, because we'll be hosting a panel discussion that will be live streaming as well about integrating research into practice with the keynote speakers and really trying to elicit information from the audience. So it's going to be a big participation event as well, which will be brilliant. So get yourself there if you haven't already signed up. So about last month's episode then, Andrew Cuff, red flags, and the serious stuff. It seems you guys rather like it when we talk about the serious and the dangerous, and I'm not surprised as well. It was brilliant, and thank you again to Andrew and to Connect for sorting out that episode. It was phenomenal. Really enjoyed the conversation. I learned an awful lot myself, as ever. But then, I mean, it's interesting because I think this episode today is on similar serious lines, just not necessarily in terms of acute medical pathology, things that need our attention right away, but certainly when we look into the research on this, especially in recent years, we kind of recognise this has been a slow burning disaster that we've been part of. We've been watching a car crash, and that's with regards to some of the myths and misconceptions, the dogmas in and around manual handling in occupational health especially. So I wanted to take a deep dive into this topic, and I knew just the man for the job, someone I've worked with recently on certain media campaigns, speaking with the press, which we talk about slightly, because that obviously is an issue we hear from you guys a lot about, is trying to improve messaging, cutting through to general public. And so with Ash, we can sort of take a look at this in every which way, in every level of analysis, because he's currently doing his PhD on this very thing. And he's been supported to do so by, as clinical lead at IPRS Health, one of the leading names in the occupational health game, and rightly so. 23 years they've been operational now, and we hear from many of their staff that listen to Physio Matters, and they've been great friends of the show over the years, likes of Carly Gibson, Ash James, Mark Hall. Your feedback trickles down to us, and so it's been awesome to work with more of you in the recent times. Now, you'll be able to tell from some of my lines of questioning in this episode that I've certainly had my fingers burnt and been stung and spent time cringing when I've been introduced to various different occupational health providers in the past. And certainly there are certain stereotypes and stigmas out there that aren't unwarranted within the manual handling and occupational health game. And so for me to be able to work with a company that do it well and do it right, that's 23 years not just existing, that's 23 years of learning and developing and improving their systems to get clinical support for their therapists. And so whilst, of course, I doubt they'd ever consider themselves perfect, they seem to be a leading light in this space, and I'm really proud to be working with them on this. They have physios, CBT therapists, nurses, national network to provide a truly holistic approach to rehab in the workplace, and trying to self-enablement and empowerment of patients, you can imagine, is always at the tip of our tongue on Physio Matters, and so that is one of their core values as well, which is really important to us. It's worth mentioning that they've led the line on integrating both physical and mental health care into occupational health services, and recognising the importance of integrating them rather than having that expected historic dualism that we've kind of come to expect, is that these things are specific occupational biomechanical factors that either might cause certain stress and anxiety, but they need to be corrected first in order to move someone past them, rather than recognising a truly integrated system within each human, and caring for them to make them better and more productive, but also happier in their work. And so they were really leading lights on that. Let's argue before it was trendy. And so which I really appreciate, of course, because that's been at the core of what we've talked about for many years now. So fair play to them. Certainly someone that you want to be looking out for jobs for, if you want to try and pursue this space, interesting roles in various different industries. And any companies that might be listening in or be pointed to, if you're pointed to this by someone that's been banging a drum for reform of manual handling, then just have a think about what Ash James says in this episode, and he's their clinical lead, being supported in his PhD to really myth bust on this stuff, and that's for me as big a signal of intent from IPRS as ever they could be. So fair play to them, and thanks a lot to Ash James, and I'll get you straight to our latest episode, which is Physio Matters 52. I'll see you at the other side. So I'm delighted to be here today at Manchester Metropolitan University with Ash James. We've just done some filming, which has been an interesting experience for both of us with Trust Me Ed, and good luck. There's plenty of material that they've been putting together on their little trip to the UK, so we're looking forward to seeing that. I've also had a chance to sit in on some of Ash's material, which means I'm in a unique spot to scratch away at some of his ideas in a way that I wouldn't have felt qualified to before today. Now, Ash James, if you've not come across him already, is a real bright light in the world of physio social media at the moment, because he's making some noises that are really resonating with a lot of you. He's been someone that we've had requests to have on the podcast to try and elaborate some of his arguments, because he's one of the forces that's really pushing against some of the dogmas in and around the manual handling and occupational health sort of environments. And so we want to see where those things are coming from and some of the underlying stories behind it. So may I welcome Ash James to the Physio Matters podcast, and please introduce yourself in more detail for the listeners.
Thanks, Jack. Very kind introduction. Yeah, so I'm Ash James. I have been qualified since 2009 from Manchester Metropolitan, and I actually spent the initial portion of my career. I've actually never worked in the NHS. I spent the initial portion of my career working in private practices. I qualified at a time where there was very little jobs. I applied to plenty in the NHS. I wanted to work in the NHS, but it was something that just never happened for me. I started working in private practices, was lucky to get a couple of really good mentors actually, that guided me in the kind of musculoskeletal realm, and then fell into semi-professional sport. I'm a rugby player all my life by trade, so that was the sport that I naturally fell into. From there started working with semi-professional teams, and then ended up working for the Welsh Rugby Union for the large portion of my career, culminating in being the sevens physiotherapist. And then I was obviously doing a lot of travelling with that job, and my wife had our second baby, so she made me get a real job. So I finished that and moved to work with IPRS in occupational health about 3 years ago now.
Okay, and so in that movement, then we're going to probably add some layers to the details as to how generalised physiotherapy can map onto occupational health, and also vice versa, how some concepts and theories in occupational health and manual handling can map onto broader physio. But what was it that sort of got you into occupational health? Was it something you just sort of fell into from that story? It was just a convenient job? Because for you to be sort of the person that we've got on the podcast now is someone who's a passionate advocate, so that can't have happened overnight. Yeah, no,
it certainly didn't, and I think there's a little bit of that. I was looking for a job to move from the Welsh Rugby Union, and I kind of suppose I evaluated the skill set that I had as a physiotherapist, having worked in professional sport, and was looking at what other sectors in physiotherapy it kind of worked with. And when I looked at occupational health, and now having worked in it actually, understanding a little bit better, they actually map on really well. Essentially, professional sport is occupational health. I'm trying to keep someone in their job. I'm trying to keep someone playing. There's return to play maps on pretty well to return to work. And there's lots of psychosocial factors that affect why someone might want to do that. There's other stakeholders like the coach who wants the player back in the team. Equally, line managers and bosses want people back in work. So there was actually a lot of similarities between the two. And not long after I started with IPRS Health, actually, I wrote a blog called The Industrial Athlete, which was a comparison of the two sectors essentially. So I fell into it because I found that it mapped on pretty well to professional sport. And the more I work in it, the more I feel like it still does that. Obviously, the patient demographic is completely different. And actually, you generally see, I would say, more complex cases in occupational health because it's not your 25-year-old elite athlete who wants to play, who doesn't have any comorbidities. It's more complex than that. It's your 54-year-old male with mild depression who has had chronic lower back pain for the last year, who's looking to return to work. So there's obviously differences there, and that's generalising, but there's differences there.
There's more variability in the demographic, but also you've got more things in play at any one time. Now, with that though, if I try and put my sort of almost job interview hat on, I think of you a few years ago when you were trying to make that transition, argument being that with the lack of not just NHS experience, but let's say just Joe Blogg's experience, your demographic, that's quite a big shift. Where was there a moment in which you had to sort of comprehend the varied sociological factors that seem to influence someone's care that you wouldn't necessarily have? And I know that from working with less pro but certainly semi-pro athletes, is that sometimes you naturally have to zoom in a little bit and that their circumstances are so different.
Yeah, 100%. I think it was definitely a big eye-opener when I moved from professional sport into Occ Health. And as you said there, the patients are a little bit more complex. You have to go into those psychosocial variables a lot more. I would say when I was in professional sport, I was much more biomedical in my viewpoint, just by the nature of what was around me. And I still think actually that's quite prevalent in professional sport now. I can't see it having changed in the last few years since I've been away from it. And that was a big transition coming into occupational health and delving into those and having those difficult conversations with people that I'd never had to have before. So I'd say the first 6 months, into occupational health was a real big experience for me and important in terms of my journey as a clinician, definitely.
No, for sure. And then when we're in occupational health, it's a catch-all umbrella term. Sometimes people even rejecting that term because it's developed some stigma. If I were to just describe some of the stereotypes that I think some of which are unfair to smear the entire industry on, but also there's some credibility to why they've emerged, which is that occupational health is just a euphemism for disrupting potentially the productivity of someone, or the fact that this occupational health has just been seen as a way of finding phase duties that aren't necessarily specific to the task. It's just the concept of rest, or occupational health that would stall managers' interactions with occupational health as seen as being just a hoop they've got to jump through somehow, as almost entertaining a lobby or an interest group or a union. There's a lot of sort of tug of war things that go on there. So what amongst that do you feel what do you think are the reasonable, accurate stereotypes that have come from that, where there's some truth to it? And what do you think, do you think that the term occupational health is something that can be appropriately rehabilitated?
Yeah, just to jump on that last comment, I do think it can be. I think there's been a big change over the last 50, 60 years in work and the way that people have seen it, and the generations have changed in terms of their attitudes towards work. If we look at the millennials coming through now, they care much more about their health at work. Work isn't somewhere that you go anymore. Work is something that you do, and that's very much the viewpoint of the millennials coming through. So what you have now is line managers and managers who, when they were initially working when they were younger, it was a completely different work environment to what it is now, and they cared much less than the current workforce do now. So I think there's a disparity between the young and the older generation at work in terms of what they care about their health. I think it is a tick box exercise for some people just to get people through and get people back. I think it can be seen as a roadblock. But equally now, working in it, and particularly working for the business that I do, that there's people who are really passionate about their health of people at work now. And I think it is much more about rehabilitating people in work. Particularly, there's much bigger focus now about mental health in the workplace. And I think at the moment in occupational health, they're still seen as separate entities. I still think they see musculoskeletal and mental health as separate issues. And I think over the next 10 to 15 years, what we're going to see is the integration of those concepts over time to meet what we would deem the biopsychosocial model now. I think they're going to integrate over the next 10, 15 years a lot better.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and here's hoping for sure. Now, I want to wade us into the history of manual handling in a second, but before I do, I want to ask about the sort of, to be more provocative on that question that I just asked, and saying that it has been. Do you think it's fair for me to suggest that there has been a successful business model around slowing people down in their return to work? So the concept in which if someone is an occupational health physio, stalling the process of return as a means of perpetuating that they need to meet this certain criteria, they need to have this certain amount of sessions, be that manual therapy or specific task-related exercise therapy that needs to be done. And there's a model of care there that has taken advantage of the corporate world where they might have been able to afford to have them off if they were under care. Is that because that whilst not across the board, granted, but I would say that I've certainly encountered that in my career.
Yeah, I would say that would be a bit unfair to apply that on a large scale to people in occupational health. I don't think that's the case with everyone. And I can see the comparison there between that and the private practice, the criticism private practice sometimes get about prolonging care and giving people a certain amount of sessions. I think there are comparisons to be made there. I think it depends on the business model. Within occupational health, there's a lot of different business models that you can work under. You can get someone paying line by line, so they do get paid by how many patients they see, in which case prolonging it would be of benefit. It would be a good business model. But there's other business models where they would pay for a set amount of time for a clinician to be on site or available to the workforce for a year, for example, or a 3-year contract, and in which case it wouldn't matter how many times they were seen by a physio. Essentially, they could see them once, give them some good advice, and they could go away again. So you could really do a good biopsychosocial approach of care in that model. I think you're probably right. I think that probably has happened in places previously, but from my experience, I think that's getting much less now. But the integration of care between occupational health teams and physiotherapy teams still needs to improve to maximise that, I think. Yeah. And that's something that there was in the recent Lancet papers that I mentioned in the presentation before, that there needs to be a real merger of occupational health and physiotherapy to make sure that we're maximising people's health. But yeah, I think you're probably right. It has happened, but I don't see it overtly now. Yeah,
because I can hear the cynicism in my own question there, and it's part of devil's advocacy. But of course, I'm not lying. I think there is a kernel of truth to it. I'm just, it's reassuring for you to not suggesting in your critique of the industry at large, and mine isn't suggesting it's endemic or it's something that's actually the norm rather than a small niche within it that we need to squeeze out with better ideas. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing for us to hover on. I want to just talk about what your specific interest within occupational health, which, as I said, is a broad umbrella term in many ways, and how have they emerged? Because we've still not mentioned the fact that you're, of course, doing some research in that direction.
Yeah, so I think, as I said, the first 6 months when I was in occupational health were a real wake-up call to me. And then as I got used to the industry, started learning a little bit more about it, I think I saw what I see is a real opportunity. So at the time, when I was working 18 months ago in occupational health, and the Mythbusters campaign first came out, and you've seen all the great work on social media that everyone's doing. The podcast is doing itself, disseminating information. There's stuff that's in the media on an ad hoc basis that is trying to promote a better image around musculoskeletal health. We might talk about that later, but whilst all that is brilliant, and obviously clinicians are doing that on a patient-to-patient basis, I felt that there was a real opportunity to reach as many people as possible. So in occupational health, I was kind of going through all the different various sectors or assessments and things that are in occupational health, and then I came across manual handling. Now immediately, I almost started snoring from the mention of it, because I've been through training myself in manual handling, and it's generally not the most interesting thing to go through. That is generally a tick box exercise for legislative reasons. But what I found was, essentially, for anyone who's moving and handling or is physically active in work, it's pretty much mandatory. So what I saw was an opportunity to use all this information from all these different campaigns and embed them in something that is a mandatory form of training for thousands of people every year. It's annually, biannually, people have to do it regularly. It's a way to get positive messages to the masses in a really positive way, potentially quickly. So that's where my interest, navigated towards in terms of manual handling. And then obviously I did my undergraduate at MMU, so linked up with a few lecturers here, Chris McCarthy, Peter Goodwin, who are both my supervisors now, my PhD. And what we're looking to do is reconceptualise manual handling as a training package, and see how we can pragmatically get that into the industry. Mainly material handling at the moment, because that's where I am. I'm in industry. I'm not in the NHS at the moment in the business that I'm in. So not so much people handling at the moment, but certainly manual material handling, which accounts for a huge proportion of injuries every year. When we think about what the problem is, this is a big problem in the UK as well. It costs a lot of money every year. It affects a lot of people. So it's something that we can really affect in terms of the economic impact, and it's a lot of people we can potentially get to with the training package itself.
Whilst it's probably better for me to suggest that it's a spectrum that's got various different lines on it, let me just try and I can easily frame two camps on this with the manual handling over the years that I've been active in this educational space, on social media, etc. Just realising now, me and my wife are sort of laughing at the fact that it's coming up to Choose Health's 5th anniversary. So we've been in this space for longer than we came to realise, really. And there's two camps in this where you've got this concept that manual handling training is rotten to its core and therefore needs to be just ousted, as if it's something that just needs to be got rid of. And then there's this concept of reforming it and using the fact that is baked into the system. Therefore, if the messages were a force for good rather than a force for bad, which of course we will detail, that seems to be. And you've ended up, alongside, of course, previous podcast guest and good friend of mine, Heather Watson, has been banging this drum as well, is that she always seemed to be in this camp of why not reform the structures that exist. But also, she was always sort of scowled at by others for suggesting that the concepts that already exist can be forces for bad, and that early intervention even is such that can be. It depends what the early intervention is. Was
course,
always
yeah.
I'm probably butchering her quotes there, but she was always sort of admitting that is a real difference. Is that it's not just early intervention; it's what. So you seem to be. It's fair for me to say in this reforming, rehabilitative camp for not just manual handling, but you've even said occupational health. Any sort of misconceptions can be sort of worked around and reformed. Can you talk briefly on the fact that, do you think there's any credence to the people that would suggest that it's rotten to its core, and if so, I think that probably will take us into some of the history of it.
Yeah, I think it's a viable viewpoint, I think, because when you look at some manual handling training, it really is awful. The imagery is awful. The messages in it are pretty bad, and it's hard to see a place for it, even if it were to be reformed, because people don't engage in it. It's a tick box exercise for them. So I think they're looking at it from two camps, the way that it's perceived and also the delivery of the message. So I think there's viability to that option, but I just think coming from my side of the fence where we're talking about reform it, if we oust it, then what's the replacement? What do we put there in its place? Because health and safety is not going to go away. That is deeply, deeply embedded, as we're probably going to talk about, into industry and into the workforce. It's a difficult enough job to try and reform it in its current form, where we're only taking away one or two messages. To completely oust it and replace it with a void, I don't think is a pragmatic option. It might, and at the start of this, when I was first looking at manual handling, I may have even been on the side of well, let's just get rid of it. But thinking about what to replace it with, that there would be too many, there would be too many things that you could potentially replace it with that may not be as good or maybe even worse. So I think what we need is, to reform it, we need a consistent message, and we need it be embedded into the current form that it's in now. That to me makes more pragmatic sense than trying to get rid of it completely and not knowing what you're going to replace it with. It's almost better the devil you know.
Sure. No, I think that makes sense. Certainly pragmatically, but even at its base concepts, there would be appropriate overlap, and it would be reframing certain messages that would be at the core of it. So why not do that under the current model?
Yeah.
Especially because that red tape, that red tape is hard to. If we're calling it red tape, not even as a smear, but as a suggestion that was put there as a well-meaning strategy, which we're going to talk about in a second. If that is there as a well-meaning strategy, and it's hard enough for us to convince people as is, then the dismissal of it outright is something that we're going to be seen to be being potentially as the dangerous ones. We're taking away a safety net there.
100%, yeah.
We're not. We're suggesting that that's not the safety net you've often thought. So we need to make that case.
Yeah, we would be seen as the villains if we were suggesting removing it completely. And I know, if we look at manual handling training as it is now, and what is in let's say a good version of manual handling training now, save the message, save the core messaging around back pain, let's say. So if we look at just what a general good manual handling course would be now, it's often a pre-course site visit. So you're looking at what the job entails, you're bespoking it to those specific individuals that you're delivering the training for. To me, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and that's something we should be doing. There's plenty of practical that are on the courses, so you're physically taking people through the jobs that they're going to have to perform and performing lots of problem-solving activities. I don't see any problem with that whatsoever. The only thing really that needs reframing is the message that we give during those two things, and how we frame the message is key, not necessarily the content. The content is, but not the way it's delivered is actually okay. And that the concepts around manual handling aren't too bad on the face of it. We just need to change the messaging within it. So
you see the framework as being such, or the scaffolding around said house, it's something you don't want to burn down.
Yeah, and even if we look at, so if we take the HSE guidelines for example, they actually advocate some spinal flexion when lifting, and they suggest that you shouldn't squat lift. Now that's in the HSE guidelines. In terms of the legislation in the manual handling's operations regulations, it mentions good handling techniques, but it doesn't say what good handling techniques are. So the legislation is fairly broad. The guidelines that most businesses conform to actually aren't too bad either. They advocate some of the things that we would agree with from the current evidence base. It's the messages that have been deeply embedded over years that have been advocated by healthcare professionals and manual handling advisors that need to modify.
So your argument is that these reformed ideas that we're going to come to discuss are actually compatible within current legislation, rather than us thinking that we need to change things from the top down to even allow for these messages to cut through.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's the key message that I want to get across. And whenever I've given presentations to businesses and things, that's one of the first things that I point out, is that they're actually in line with the current legislation, because that's immediately, when you talk about spinal flexion, it's this panic button that everyone starts to press and starts to worry, well, we can't be telling people to do that. When actually, there's nothing in the guidelines or the legislation that suggests that we shouldn't be doing that. And the legislative issue is something that businesses worry about the most, I think.
Immediate demonstration of the congruence between what seem new ideas and the actual hard, fast legal legislation to it. That's a really good point, and I think one that I've certainly overlooked. And it just goes to show it's people like you that need to zoom into these things to fine tooth comb them, that help to educate us on just how practically feasible these things are, when the scale of the fight can seem pretty daunting for the reasons we've already described.
Yeah, and it still seems pretty daunting now, and I think that's another good reason why ousting it is not necessarily the best idea altogether, because we actually have the framework and the bed for it to sit on quite nicely if we reframe the message.
Okay. Yeah, I'm up for that. You've certainly convinced me, even if I was only pretending to not be already. Now, what we know now as contemporary manual handling advice, how did that emerge? Can you walk us through the history?
Yeah, so granted, I had to do a bit of homework on this one myself as well, but it's an interesting question to answer. So the biomechanical research on, or the medical research on disc protrusions and disc prolapses and things goes back to the mid 1800s. So that research has been ongoing for a long period of time, and the link between potential work and disc protrusion or flexion has been there for a little while and continues to be there today, which we'll talk about. But the immediate need for a kind of a sweeping, broad campaign, if you like, and some limitations on workload actually came in World War II. So when obviously the majority of the men were out fighting, it was the Department of Labour in America that brought in some pound restrictions. It was £50 for men, £25 for women on lifting when they were in the factories. Now, they were obviously, that biomechanical research was ongoing at the time, so they'd already kind of got a rough idea that these things maybe, or they thought these things were causing injury. Looking back on it now through the lens of someone like Tim Gabbett's research, when we look at acute to chronic workload, what we had there was a large number of people spiking their load considerably over a short space of time compared to what they were doing previously. So we could look at it as a load issue rather than a biomechanical position issue, but essentially that was where the initial increase came in. It was Document 11, a guide to preventing weightlifting injuries, that came out from the Department of Labour. And they essentially stayed the same for about 25 years into the 60s. Continuing kinematic and biomechanical research was going alongside this, and they were obviously making strides into understanding this in vitro model of disc failure that was continuing on to the 60s. And then the first kind of paper that I could find was from Ben Davis, who teamed up with Rosper in 1969, and that was the kind of first manual handling course, if you like, that had been created. So he was central in Birmingham, and in the surrounding factories they would send one person from each of the surrounding factories, and this guy Ben Davis would go through different ways to lift, different ways to move, use materials from their factories, and talk about an ideal lifting posture and position. And that essentially is where modern manual handling came from. Now, these ideas were developed on through the 70s, and then NIOSH, so the National Institute of Safety and Health, came up with the NIOSH lifting guidelines, which basically combined epidemiological evidence, psychophysical, medical, engineering. So all the information they had at the time, they combined into producing these NIOSH lifting guidelines. So essentially what you do is put in different parameters, and it gives you a risk model. How risky is it to lift or move that certain object, and they stand today. But the history of that is all based on a disc stress model. So the whole focus is on how much does lifting and moving stress the disc, and it doesn't necessarily take into account any of the more broader concepts from the in vivo modelling that we've seen today, or any of the modern pain concepts that we know of today. The biopsychosocial model, it very much focuses on the bio, and that's pretty much it.
And when we look back over those sorts of, you can for me, I can just so see how that would emerge from the understanding that we had in terms of the science as it stood, and also those industrial correlations that seem to emerge, especially around a changing workforce. Do you look back and see any particular steps that put your head in your hands, where you're just like, oh God, that was a stupid leap, or do you see a totally understandable journey towards the sort of dogmas that we've come to see?
Yeah, I 100% see how it's emerged, and you could see at the time how it makes perfect sense looking at the epidemiology. So what they had was a workforce that were moving and handling objects that seemed to get more back pain than others. And on the face of it, without doing the full plethora of research that we have today, it seemed to make sense. And I go back to this word pragmatic again. They had to do something. They had to try and do something to mitigate the risks that were happening. Going back to the war, there's an article that I read that essentially almost affected the production of ammunition for the war. So essentially it could have affected the war effort. They had to do something, they had to respond quickly and do something, and this was the way that they chose from the evidence that they had at the time. So it makes perfect sense to me that this is how it's emerged. The problem is now it's so deeply entrenched and deeply embedded into industry and into the workplace that it's very difficult to change any hearts and minds over it. And we need to do that with up-to-date modern evidence as quickly as possible, really. And as I say, it doesn't involve massive amounts of changes from my point of view. It's nuancing the messages and changing some of the fearful messages that we push onto the training. And essentially, some of those fearful messages are coming from the healthcare professionals themselves. They're not necessarily coming from the legislation or the guidelines or the evidence or the patients themselves.
Yeah, I want to just hover on that a little bit, because you did mention about the fact, and I think that on a mechanistic level with regards to the lifting, I think you're right, it is on this idea of a disc-sparing thing. We'll talk about that in a second, but I think it does also map on to just a movement normalising model, which maps onto ergonomics. It's this concept of right and wrong, the concept of biomechanical normal at best, optimal, and not necessarily task-specific, person-specific optimal. It's this idea of a mean average plumb line style, which goes from posture to form to sitting position. And so in amongst that, I'm going to leave that as a question, because I sense that we probably agree on that. But I do want to ask the question, because Physio Matters has always been about the idea that we offer quite a lot of challenges, and this is another fresh one for different people, different communities. But I always say we've got to try and get our house in order, and we've always been known for that. It's talking about what we do well, but not. To also talk about what we don't do well. And then this, I want to ask, when you've delved into the history of things and you look about how these what I'm calling dogmas and tropes have emerged, how complicit has physiotherapy been in that, bearing in mind that we've been considered the medical arm that moves into biomechanics? We're the established order of medical professional that us and OTs, but really, especially because we're trying to keep us physio hats on. I want to know what your sort of position is on how complicit, not to blame, but certainly that in a situation how involved we were in perpetuating these things.
Yeah, I think we were massively complicit in the perpetuation of all these myths, particularly in the workplace. I think maybe not so earlier on, because I don't think physio is as involved directly with the workforce as it is now. So when we're talking about manual handling training, I think a lot of that initially was delivered by health and safety officers who'd been trained or picked up information by medical professionals. So essentially the message was coming from healthcare professionals, but I think it's been misconstrued along the way by the delivery of the message by non-medical people through no fault of their own, just by their own understanding of what it is, and their own implicit biases and their past experiences of what's made their back hurt or what they think has made their back hurt, and then they're teaching a group of people how to move and handle. And I think the message has just been misconstrued a little bit over time. But also, we are the ones involved in the research, and I think particularly the in vitro modelling biomechanical disc pathology model is something that we have very much been complicit with over time, and we still, a lot of physios out there will still comply to now, if you look at any of the media things that we've done lately anyway. On
just on a pathology level, independent of biomechanics or certainly occupational health biomechanics, the two names, as soon as you start thinking about disc pathology, you think Mackenzie and you think McGill. And although McGill's not a physio, his disciples mostly are.
Yeah.
And so it does become, I suppose, embedded in that, doesn't it?
Yeah, when I think back to my earlier time as a physio, when I've 100% been guilty of thinking in that way, when I think back to why I thought like that, it seemed to just make sense at the time. But when I look back now and when I think of myself thinking that, I'm not sure why it made sense. It was just something innate that I'd probably picked up on a societal level, that there was a right and wrong way to move. And I think that's how deeply embedded this issue is. If you go out on the street and you ask someone who's non-medical, who's maybe never even done a manual handling training, what's the best way to pick something up, what's the best way to pick a box up, I would bet some money on it that they would say straight back, bent knees, you've got to mind your back. I think that would be, a 90% hit in the public domain. That's how deeply embedded all this is.
Yeah, I think you're right. And as to how, I think is an interesting sociological phenomenon in a sense. I think it comes from various places. When I've given thought to it, and see what you think of this, we're sort of going to be moving people towards this concept of sort of movement relativism, this idea that there is a broader range of ways in which we can move rather than the sort of specifics of movement normalising. But actually, that doesn't suit how, if we've considered ourselves, all the things around us, the machines, the vehicles that we use, etc., there isn't a lot of degrees of freedom to some of those objects and things that we trust and things that we might associate and even some things that we'll humanise. And things that we interact with don't have as many degrees of freedom, and so we sometimes maybe will over-apply that to ourselves. Similarly, you've got this bottom-up approach to the purity of movement that toddlers do, and the idea that toddlers squat, and it's one of the fun tropes that you have with the biomechanical bods, especially in sport and exercise, where they don't account for the head being the 2/3 of the body weight at the very least of the toddler. So of course they'll squat differently, and it looks perfect, but the femoral length is rather different to ours. And all the things that we know to sort of laugh at. But I think one or all of those different factors seems to have probably played a part in this concept where people feel that there is a right and wrong and crave the expertise that we seem to have as physios and other health professionals to offer them that support. Now, I part of the reason I've been thinking about this is because is that a sort of delegation of responsibility that occurs in society if there is a right or wrong, where the patients or people are craving a right and wrong as a means of then delegating the thought of having to explore it themselves. Plus, are there businesses, legislators, policymakers that are delegating the responsibility to Joe Bloggs because they're saying, well, we've put this safety net in place, so if we've told you how to move, then if you deviate from that and get injured, it's not our fault. So there's this constant... So you can imagine me, one of the big R's being responsibility, has ended up thinking a lot on this. And so I've said a lot there. I'm going to throw it back at you. Where do you think the line lies?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is about the legislative issue. Businesses on the whole, from what I can see and what I can experience, is they don't particularly like a grey area. And this is a big grey area. Right. They like black and white. This is the way to do things. This is not the way to do things. Wear your gloves when you're chopping that, or you'll chop your finger off. Don't wear it. And I think what's happened is health and safety has just become safety, and there's not much health within it. I think the main focus is generally on safety, and with safety there has to be a right and a wrong way to do something. Otherwise it's very difficult to monitor, it's very difficult to advise on if there's no black or white, yes or no. So I think actually the model has partly been driven by the research, but partly has been driven by industry craving this need for there to be a right and a wrong answer and a right and a wrong way to do things, because it's easier for them. It's easier for them, and with the claims culture that you're talking about, which isn't too prevalent in this country, but is prevalent, it's probably more prevalent in the US, but it's exactly as you said, if a business lays out, well, this is the way we've taught you to do it, you seem to have hurt your back, and from what we can tell, you weren't doing it in the correct way, therefore it's your fault. So you can't make a claim. And it's an easy out for them. It's a much harder sell to sell this grey area to people, because even though it's evidence-based and it will essentially improve health, potentially, we don't know yet, the research hasn't been done, fingers crossed it goes that way, but essentially we want to try and put the health back into health and safety a little bit, and try and make it a little bit more about the individual and try and get better outcomes, which doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. What the case is at the moment is they just want to prevent as many accidents as possible.
One of the, because that's awesome, because that's added that extra bit to what I was saying, where my although I've done, but I've never had an Occupational Health specific role. I suppose I've worked with Design to Move and learnt a lot from that, but generally speaking, I can't pretend to have done the shipyard steelworks sort of nitty gritty, or even the office work that means that you get this on such a regular basis. So you've given an industry example that feeds into what I was describing. But one thing that I wonder if you might be either missing or we've not talked about is that the way in which physiotherapy became so tethered to this is because the NHS is an employer of, they say, I think it's the second or third largest employer of humans in the world. I think it's like Indian steel industry, Chinese railway, something like that. I might be butchering this, but it's a massive amount of people. And so you're talking movement of loads. As soon as we get onto movement of people, or people and loads, the manual handling training that goes on through the NHS, there's often a physiotherapist that seems to be tethered to that. Yeah. And so is that another route to which there's been a natural integration between manual handling dogmas, movement normalising, and then the supposed expertise that physiotherapists that become biomechanists, that's where some of that complexity emerged, is more in movement and handling of people.
Yeah, I think, if from my presentation today there was a slide up there from 1943 which talked about nursing back strains, and they were talking in that from the NHS point of view of normalising movement and the right posture and the right way to do something, for example. And I think, as you've said, that's where physios have come into it from the NHS route, from that side of things. They, I think, have obviously picked up on messages that were out there already from industry. I don't see why they would, at that time, completely buck the trend to what was going on in industry. I'm assuming there would have been some, crossover understanding of, well, what are you guys doing over there? We need to do it over here. That's a massive assumption that I'm making, that those conversations happened. I would like to think they did. But they were using the available evidence at the time. We didn't have as much pain science as we do now. We don't have a deeper understanding, certainly on a scale as large as we do now. So pain science wasn't as it is now, and we certainly didn't have the in vivo modelling that we have now, which seems to be more relevant to a living human population. So I think they were using the available evidence. I don't blame the physios of that time for looking at what was doing in industry and seemingly was being successful, because essentially what it was doing initially was moderating load, which I think there is some legs in. I don't think, we'll probably get onto it, but the position of the spine for me is much less important than it ever has been. But I think load has a role to play, and essentially what those early models did was moderate load.
And yielded success when they did it in the short term.
Exactly.
That's why, I'm in agreement with you, and I sometimes make sure that my mask slips, because I'm playing devil's advocate to ask some of these questions, but I totally agree with that, because you can so see how these things can perpetuate because of the successes that they can yield in the short term, because of load modification and or other variables such as attention, basic time frames, ability to be listened to and respected for it, and then moving on past it. And then, as far as I'm aware as well, the evidence suggests that even when attempting to retain a certain strategy, people tend to liberate their movement and get better. When they're then trekked in on the few tests that they've done where they've revisited, it's often that the movement patterns are back to where they used to be, rather than it being that they've been strict, but they're still not necessarily out of recurrence.
Exactly. Behaviour change is really difficult, and what happens is people go on manual handling training courses, do it on the day, get the tick box, go back to work and do everything as they were doing anyway, which includes spinal flexion, which I think is an argument that the biomechanists can use actually as to why that back injuries are still so high, because they will say, well, people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. So that's an argument for the biomechanists there that I've just given for free.
Well, you should have done. No, you're right. We've got to account for those things. Is that but I think the fact that it's not listened to is also one that, why is it not? Is it practical? Is it relevant? And is it something that would resonate?
I think initially lifting that way, if you're a baggage handler at an airport, you're not going to squat lift every single time you pick a bag up. Otherwise, you're going to get through half the amount of work that you would in a normal day. So it's not practical for one thing, I don't think. The second reason that it's not adhered to is because I don't think people are as worried about it as we are. on a lot of cases. I don't think they are. I did a course recently where I was doing a portion of the manual handling training, and I was doing a fact versus fib exercise where people would stand either side of the room and I would put a statement up, and one side would be true and one side would be false. And I think one of them was bending is bad for your back. And I think all the health and safety people went to the true side, and the 2 union reps that were in there who were on the job every day went to the false side. And I said, why are you guys still over there? And they said, because we do it every day and we're all right.
Yeah.
So
I totally agree with that. I think that's what we see, isn't it? I think if I try to force myself to disagree with it, I think I sort of disagree when it comes to the patients that will then come in injured.
Yeah.
They'll then make the misattribution on their own self. They'll sort of self-flagellate a bit, and they'll blame themselves. Or, right, maybe this. When I ask them, I often give the open quote, what do you think's going on and why do you think it's happening and stuff? And they'll often say, well, I think this is my ignorance of the manual handling training that I've always sort of not done. I think this is catching up on me. I think I've probably damaged myself from a lot of heavy work over my life and stuff. If you'd have caught them before they were injured, they'd have been one of those people moving to your fib side. Yeah. But then equally, when they get that problem, they're trying to conceptualise it, and then they suddenly succumb to the idea that it's their fault in that way, and put the responsibility on themselves, thinking that their employers delegated that responsibility to them for the reasons we talked about earlier. Do you see that and hear that too?
Yeah, 100%. That's the case that I see more often than not. The example of the guys that were going over to the false side was, someone who was pain free, which I obviously don't see an awful lot of as a clinician. They only generally come to me when they've got an injury. So I see much more of the people that, as you said, if you'd have caught them a week before or observed them working a week before, they're probably flexing away no problem whatsoever on the job and not particularly seeing a problem with it. But as soon as they get a problem, all these the beliefs that they hold and the societal beliefs that we all have kind of creep in, and they start to attribute those causal factors to their pain, which we know we see a lot of anyway. And it's breaking down those beliefs that is really important when you're in the clinic. That's why I like to do once I'm into rehab with people, particularly in work, do a lot of experiential learning where we get stuff that they do on their job and just do it in the clinic and reperform it and do it in a non-painful way. And try to break down movements into sections and make them realise, not just talk at them and try and educate them, but actually do the things and make them realise that actually you can do them in a painful way, and those movements aren't inherently bad. Because what happens is people go through manual handling training, they don't change their behaviour after and carry on as normal, which is an argument for the biomechanists, but an argument then again from the other side, which I would much more attribute myself with, is that they move as they normally have, but now after manual handling training what they have is a fear and a belief that what they're doing is bad for their spine. So they might get home and have a little bit of a sore back, a bit of a stiff back at the end of a day, just because they've worked muscles to fatigue in some cases, and they're starting to think, I didn't really bend my knees, or I was flexing quite a lot today, and they're left with those beliefs from the manual handling training, even though they don't perform those tasks that way.
Yeah, it's that misattribution of cause, isn't it?
Yeah.
Rather than recognising that the bigger picture, it's been oversimplified and therefore comes with consequences.
Yeah.
So no, I'd agree with that. I think one of the key pivot points on this as to whether one is more optimal than the other with regards to sparing or loading and challenge of the disc, which has been a big controversy across different models of practice for as long as I've certainly been a physio and far beyond now, is has the disc got a finite amount of flexion loads or loads in general, or a certain amount of tolerance that it can take before it either herniates or degenerates, and that is a model that is representative not just of pain but of structural failure. Mm-hmm. And then if we're making a case to liberate spinal flexion, or at least sort of not demonise it, then in doing so we're actually having to suggest that the disc will adapt much like a tendon, a muscle, not necessarily in the same physiological way, but it also under stress will remodel to some extent, or at least become more robust to the loads that have put upon it. So where are we at with that science?
Yeah, so this is the crux of the argument, really, and this is where I've got Greg Lehman on my shoulder here, listening in and probably correcting everything I say. It is the crux of the argument, and I think if we look at the in vitro modelling and the way that the research has been conducted, which is where the idea of cyclic spinal loading in flexion with compression herniates discs. That's the argument that's put forward by the in vitro modelling, and the way they do that is they take an animal or a human spine model, put it in a jig, and they flex it and extend it until the disc fails, and they measure the pressures around that, and that's where the in vitro modelling data has come from. Now, what that research tells us is that the disc has a finite amount of loads within it, and eventually it will fail. Now, there's a number of issues that I have with that research, and I think are valid. Is that it's dead tissue essentially. Sometimes it's not even human tissue, so it's not accounting for the nutrition moving around the discs with movements. So there's a lot of inherent problems with in vitro modelling that I don't think we can extrapolate into a living human. But what it does give us is it gives us that there's a finite value. They also give it a lifetime of cycles of load in that jig in one go, essentially. So it's a lot of load for something to take that isn't alive and would never do that amount of repetitive load in one go ever. So that's the issue with that for me. And they also, when they perform, if you look at the research in depth, and I haven't got the figures in my head in terms of the degrees, but they don't generally take it to end of range. So you would think in that model that they would put it in the jig and they would take it to maximal flexion repeatedly to see what the failure levels were. And actually what they do is they don't take it to end range at all. They only just go past neutral in either direction of flexion and extension, which is something we do all when we're sitting down, when we stand up. We go within those ranges all the time. So to say that is dangerous for the spine, or that the spine doesn't adapt to those ranges of movement, seems a bit absurd, considering that we stay within those ranges all day, every day.
Or even if they were right, it's not something that could be feasibly avoided.
Exactly. Even if they were right, it's not something that could be avoided. And when we look at flexion in terms of avoidance, Potvin studies show us that even when you try and cue someone to stay in extension, so to keep that lordosis there, they still flex their spine. So it's almost impossible to maintain or to not flex the spine to some degree in any movement. So that's the in vitro modelling. What the in vivo modelling tells us is that the disc can adapt. So if we look at Bowden's work in 2016, they show that a certain amount of physical loading is advantageous for the disc, and that the disc does adapt to load, and it improves its tolerance to said load. Paper a couple of days ago from Fiona Wilson, who looked at rowers, also pointed out that there's only a certain amount of rowers that get lower back pain. There's a large proportion of rowers that don't get back pain at all, even though their rate is slightly higher. There's a proportion that don't get lower back pain, and they do flexion under load all day, every day, which suggests that likelihood is that the disc responds well to cyclic loading and does adapt. So we get this story from the in vitro modelling that there's a finite limit, but the in vivo model tells us that we can progress that finite limit further down the tolerance scale. So if we keep active, and lifting to a certain extent is good for that, we should be lifting, that's advantageous for the disc, then as long as we stay within our tolerance limits and don't push it towards our tolerance limits, we can adapt and then improve over time.
As it stands, how do you feel our profession and the industry at large sees the spinal sparing debate? And especially when we're considering the movement normalising concept as being the other side of that. And does any evidence beyond anecdotal and observational contribute to your opinion on these things?
Yeah, so I think I alluded to that in my presentation. I think towards the start of it, I think if I was going off Twitter, I'd be fairly optimistic. The conversations I have on Twitter, people are fairly switched on and engaged, and I think probably majority of the podcast listeners are probably aligning themselves more closely towards you and I. But beyond anecdote, if we look at Dave Nolan's great research he did last year with Kieran and Peter O'Sullivan, they looked at what physiotherapists and manual handling advisors' beliefs were about the safest way to lift, and he showed them 4 pictures, and physios and manual handling advisors had to pick which ones were the safest. And by far and away, the ones that they picked were the spine sparing pictures with a traditional straight back bent knee. So that research would suggest that actually, as a profession, we still harbour the belief that rounding the back is a negative thing. And actually, the manual handling advisors scored much higher than physiotherapists. So physiotherapists tend to be a little bit better than manual handling advisors. And those with higher scores had poorer associated back beliefs on the backpack questionnaire. So the ones that attributed the pictures to spine sparing being the safest also had the poorest back pain beliefs. So my optimism from Twitter is quickly shattered by the reality that actually the majority of physios out there are probably purporting a message that spine sparing is the best thing to do in a lifting and moving and handling situation. So, there's a lot of work to do, I think, on a large level, which again is why I think, manual handling is a good vehicle for that. Physios have to go manual handling training as well. They have to go through the NHS manual handling training, or a lot of them have to do it in private industry as well. So I think it's a nice vehicle to be able to get those messages across to physiotherapists as well. Like you've alluded to before, we have to get our own house in order first, and I think it starts with all of us singing off the same hymn sheet, which is not a difficult thing to do, because if I've probably contradicted myself a couple of times today, and certainly if you talk to someone like Greg Lehman, he's not 100% convinced either way. So it's difficult to hang our hats on something, but I think, as we've discussed off camera, we need to be pragmatic, and we need to advise patients in a certain way. So I think we need to align our views as a profession and come up with whether that's a position paper, a document, or something that says this is what we're going to advise in terms of moving and handling. I think that would be a nice way to start to get everyone on the same page as quickly as possible.
And I think that's one of the tough things, isn't it? It's why we're trying to use this term, especially with the big R's. It's this notion of reducing unwarranted variation, because the variation is so charming to the profession, and naturally we need the variation both as clinicians and also as industries at large within groups within it need to be varied to some extent. We don't want to stop the character emerging. But when it comes to, we need to recognise that, said, if we're going to sing off the same hymn sheet, we can accept that the hymn sheet is going to be changing, and that there's a sort of several different hymns on said hymn sheet. So I suppose that's the thing, is just we need to make sure we try and bake in an appropriate amount of variation, so that it's not seen as being just a new dogma. Because one of the things I wanted to do, just again as devil's advocacy more than anything, just because most listeners will know me enough to know that if I say these questions without that caveat, then they just know that I was outright lying. But if I were to then say that physios in that paper, Dave Nolan's work, which is brilliant and definitely will be well referenced and made available on Google Drive, but that material is, we're even talking about it as being that the physiotherapists that selected the spinal sparing models under low load lifting, we are quite loftily suggesting that they're wrong. Do we have the evidence to suggest that they are in a meaningful way that not necessarily guaranteed definite sort of empirical causal green light, but I mean that we're inferring that they are wrong to be selecting that, and we're suggesting a more movement liberation, shall we say, approach to things. But can we make the case for and against, where because they might be frustrated, people might be frustrated over the fact that we might be saying that there's no evidence that they're right, but also there's no evidence that we're wrong necessarily.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, and I think it's definitely worth exploring. So there are times with patients where if spinal flexion is provocative for their pain, that I do advise against it sometimes. So I suppose the question is a little bit more nuanced than look at these pictures and which one's the best, because for some people that might be the best way for them to lift. But in terms of the overall evidence, there's if we look at Ribeiro's work, for example, where he looks at dose-response relationship between different postures and lower back pain, there doesn't seem to be one there. There's a plethora of evidence which I'll give you for the Google Drive, but I think it's inconclusive at the moment. There doesn't seem to be, if we look at Dryshaft's work in vivo, where they look at stoop and squat lifting, there's about a 4% difference in terms of intradiscal pressure. But again, that's us being disc-centric. We're not thinking about the other 90% of patients who have non-specific lower back pain that's nothing to do with the disc. So I think the question is a little bit more nuanced than the right way or the wrong way. I think that there's an n equals 1 kind of viewpoint that we need to take, that for some people that might be useful, but I don't think we can definitively say they're wrong, but they're certainly not definitively right either. And there's one, and I don't think it's it becomes a semantic argument. But just because there's a right and a wrong, I don't think that there's two options. I think it's a scale, and one is more likely right than the other.
That's right. Yeah, the fulcrum doesn't need to sit right between those two points of view.
No.
Now, the conclusions of that work, if we talk specifically about Dave Nolan's stuff, but it's also supported at various different levels of analysis.
Yeah.
That seems to play out. I would say that suits my bias in various ways, especially my anecdotal bias to what I've encountered in practice, and doing a lot of workshops and lectures and conferences and all sorts of stuff like that in conversations with various experts, including yourself, that have lived and breathed this, right? But my issue sometimes with that research particularly, although accounted for to some degree in the narrative with it, is that, let's just say physios that were asked those questions, is that my geeky interest in body condition and consciousness, the way that humans reason, the ways in which they draw on the past and histories and their own beliefs, is such that there might well be that those physiotherapists have encountered more human beings where they've actually watched them pick up a box, or that the patient's telling them it hurts to pick up a box, in which changing them from a spinal flexion model to a spinal sparing model, a classic hip hinge, weight as bow type movement, is less painful because it might be inherently different. Let's not say better, but it's because it's been different. It doesn't take many of those experiences in someone's career for that to reinforce that model. So it's not necessarily inherently bad beliefs necessarily, it's just that they're a selected population, because the amount of spines that they've seen flex, it could well be that is less correct, even though there's no context given. They're just pictures. They're going to apply the context naturally through their own experiences.
It's a valid point, but I think if that was the case, I don't think we'd see the consistency over different research papers. Whilst Dave's hasn't been replicated exactly elsewhere, I think we see other research papers like it, some of which I've mentioned, that look at the relationship between flexing and lifting, whether that's biomechanically or whether that's otherwise. I don't think we'd see the consistency in findings from country to country, from researcher to researcher. And to me, that we can't change our practice from one definitive paper. I don't think anyone would do that. I think what we've got to do is look at the body of evidence and weigh up what is more likely. So again, I think I'd prefer that term than right or wrong. I always tend to deal in what is more likely from the balance of evidence. And I think on balance of evidence, it's very unlikely that in each of those populations, they were selected populations that just happened to prefer spinal sparing movements than flexing, or the other way around. I don't think we'd see the consistency.
No, that's certainly a fair enough space for us to live in the grey area. I totally accept that. What I think it does map onto is that both you and I have been involved in, unfortunately more you than me right now, is the talking with the media and trying to help get some of these messages through. And I work with the Times more last year than this year. You've done some work with some of the tabloids and Huffington Post and things like that. Now, the reason I mention that is because it's not a perfect correlation, but I ended up in a situation where I was trying to make the case that we don't need to demonise slouching, and it really well articulated. I was working with Peter B, great health journalist at the Times, and definitely there was nothing in there that I would disagree with. It certainly represented my position and ran everything by me and things like that. Now, that got picked up by some of the tabloids, in which it was then as if it was an advocation of slouching, which is, of course, a very different position. I was simply trying to get people to recognise that, especially without specific context, it's something that people that aren't in pain can probably worry less about the specifics of their ergonomics, was my core argument. That's very different to an advocation that slouching is the best way, which was just one degree of separation.
Don't worry about slouching is a bit different to
definitely slouch.
Now,
you've also had those sort of similar things where you've been strawmanned a little bit. That's despite both of us probably being on the... We have a habit of offering 10 different caveats, and we couch it as best we can, and we try and be clear, and we talk about the nuance as best we can. Are these willful misrepresentations, not just by the media, but it also plays on to other groups that disagree with us? Sometimes patients will hear these things. Are these just because they're such confrontational ideas to the norm, or is it that we're just genuinely not doing a good enough job to nuance our views?
Yeah, I don't think certainly in the experiences that I've had, I'm not sure how I could have nuanced it more. I'm not sure how I could have caveated what I was saying any more than I did without sounding ridiculous. So I'm not sure it's that. I'm sure I could improve. I'm sure we could improve at getting our message across. And when we look at the great communicators in our profession, people like Peter O'Sullivan and Lorimer Mosley, I think we can certainly take lessons from them in how to get our messages across. And I think simplifying it as best we can is a good way to go. But I think partly it's due to the way that media is consumed now. It's clickbait. People want something that they can read that takes them 2 minutes to read. They don't want to sit down and read something in depth and have to ingest information. They just want something that's a bit sensationalist, and the journalists know that. So I think they're trying to look for the things that are most provocative to say and to have as a headline. So I think part of it is just the way that the medium is consumed by people. So I think that's an inherent issue. But again, it goes back to getting our house in order. I think we've got different physios in the profession saying different things in the media, and not in terms of slightly different things in terms of the way that the messages are phrased. I mean completely different messages. In the last one I did, there was myself and a doctor in giving the expert opinions, if you like, and we had completely different views on things. And I think where there's conflicting views, it's so unhelpful to the public as a message because they just end up more confused. I don't think it's helpful in any way, shape, or I would have rather have not done that article because I don't think it added anything. I don't think it helped anyone. So I think we need to get our own house in order first, and the media need to we need to help the media understand our viewpoint a little bit better, I think, in terms of what we're trying to do. We're trying to help patients. We're not trying to sell newspapers or get the most clicks on an article. We're trying to help those that do read it. But again, ad hoc media articles and things like that, I don't think are, whilst I definitely think we should still do them and they're good to get in people's faces, it's not something that, you only have to read the comment section underneath and realise how different views are of the public. We don't know how many are actually not commenting and taking on board the information.
Well, the middle ground never do.
Yeah, we're never going to know that.
You're going to get people that loved it that'll comment and hated it that'll comment, and
the
people that sort of shrug their shoulders at it and vaguely touch them slightly and then moved on to the next article. They're not going to.
No.
Have you ever? I'm thinking about how much of a gobshite I am, but I've never commented on an article that I've read online.
No, neither have I.
It's not my thing. Even blogs and stuff, even things that have really. I try if there's a medium that I'm constantly engaging with that's really enriching my life, especially as someone that's got a podcasting which people sometimes take for granted. I try to reach out to certain platforms and stuff, but even then I'm not doing that every time.
Yeah.
So the people that are often bashing the keyboard, they can't be the mean, can they?
They're not.
It can't be the case. Well, I've slid us into the next question, so we're just going to keep this analysis up because my next question was going to be how might we stop patients being overprotective if indeed it sounds like our analysis is that there are certain features and variables that are making them so, particularly once they've developed some symptoms.
Yeah.
So staying on that theme, although not to overgeneralise, we've then gone for half the answer's been done in a sense that we've get our house in order. We sound like we agree on, and I can't even make a case that's not at the core and the heart of everything that I've ever stood for. It does sound like we agree on that. Media representation, I think we could probably pad out a little bit, but there's probably no need. I think we've said the core bits that I know you and I agree on that. But there are several other layers of analysis that are well worth us touching on. So let's go to that question then. How might we stop patients being overprotective? What other variables can we interfere with?
Yeah, I think the policy change in the workplace is sticking with occupational health. That's obviously a huge one, and that's part of what my research is trying to contribute to. And I think that is something that is huge in terms of making removing the fear from people at work is huge and will go a massive way in terms of that overprotectiveness. What work is doing as well, going back to that health and safety model and them just looking at the safety, they're basing their prevention models on what is the worst case scenario. In most cases it's death in, big industrial, they're trying to prevent death. So everything is scary. Don't touch this, don't move that, don't stand there for too long. Look before you cross, only go over zebra crossings. Look left, look right. Everything in the workplace is geared towards the possible worst case scenario, which, might work when we're trying to prevent death, but for back pain and the appeal to fear for back pain, we know doesn't necessarily work. Well, we know it doesn't work, and it hasn't worked for however long we've been doing it. So I think policy change in the workplace is a huge one in terms of making people less overprotective, because that's essentially where they take their lead from. That's where they get most of their information from, and that's how they manage their day to day. It's what the messages they take home when they do DIY at home. It's the messages they take into other areas of their life. So policy change at work is massive for me. That's a real big one. I think another one that we need to look at is advisory boards. So workplaces often take their cues from the HSE, ROSPA, big governing occupational health bodies, ACPO. I think advisory bodies need to play their part in perpetuating the positive messages that we are. I had a really good meeting in this office actually with someone from the HSE not too long ago, their head of MSK policy, and he was really on board with the messages that we're trying to perpetuate. There was no big talk of major policy change yet because we haven't, the research hasn't been done yet. It was just an opening conversation, but opening the dialogue between the advisory groups and clinicians and researchers, I think, is massively important and probably isn't done enough.
Well, it migrates the two positions together, even if they are only slightly opposed. The longer that they remain so, they're not going to diverge. So if that conversation is ongoing and it's checked in on, then if there is opposition at the end and you've decreased the impact because you've decreased the negative impact where it collide, because you've managed to actually make people realise how similar these things are, and they're coming from the same place. But I want to just hover on the forces in play for changes in policy and the way in which policies want to emerge, or ideas need to emerge, or consensus develop, rather than it just being something that's more of a top-down phenomena. What processes do you feel are best instigated in order to make those policy changes? Of course, the right conversations and getting the right people in the right rooms, of course, but how can we find ways in communities of practice to develop said consensus so it doesn't seem like it's gospel according to Ash and Jack?
I think that's a good point really. I think consensus groups are a good way to do that, but I think by far and away probably the best vehicle and what policymakers will respond to the most is a good evidence base. And I think improving the evidence base in this area, there's a lot going on in occupational health at the moment. Actually, there's a lot of people doing research in there. People like Dave, Peter O'Sullivan's ventured into occupational health as well. But I think around the specifics of what we need to change, I think good, solid evidence in this area is what if we can go to policymakers and say, here's the research. This is what we've got. This is what we've found. It's not just our research. This has been replicated a number of times. I'm not saying this is an easy process or a quick process. This is going to take time to do, but I think we need to be able to back up what we do with, and just from a personal ethical point of view, I think policy change should be made on the back of evidence. I don't think it should be made by necessarily big committee groups even. I think they're useful and they have their place, but they're all entrenched in their own personal biases, and it only takes a couple of strong personalities within a committee group to modify the viewpoints of a few within there, and then all of a sudden you've got a viewpoint that you might not necessarily agree with that's being purported by the group you're a part of. So I think impartial research is personally my preference in terms of driving policy change.
Well, I completely agree with that, but I also hover over this notion that what is then sufficient evidence to change policy, especially when we know that these things get carved into stone. Let's say there was a massively successful movement in which the concepts of spinal sparing, let's say, we managed to policies changed sufficiently that we managed to change the social stigma around it and the blame game and the culture and the industry around it. We started to water that down. These things then get chalked up as being new policies. Now, this argument that gets made where the pendulum gets swinging too far, and I often call this said pendulum a wrecking ball sometimes, where sometimes we can get carried away on a theme, especially when you feel like you're into something novel.
Yeah.
Let's just argue that we then take it too far, and it turns out that new evidence emerges that we do find a be that individualised or stratified limit, that where it is wise to spare the spine to some degree on certain loads. Let's argue that we suddenly do some really specific research where it's a well-replicated trial design in 10 years' time, then starts to recognise that these particular carpet fitters that are loading of a particular weight in a particular position of a particular shape, seems wise for them to keep the load closer to them and spare the spine more. I'm making this up.
Yeah.
Now, on the mechanistic principles we've been talking about, I worry that we would potentially make things we could end up in a situation where we end up having to have the same fight again in a different direction for the sake of adding the nuance post hoc.
Yeah.
So how can we try and change policy to keep it in the grey area, but also make a decision that helps people and businesses and patients to actually have an answer without us then potentially just having another wrong answer that's hopefully just slightly better?
Yeah, and I think policy at the moment, as I've alluded to, is already doing that to a certain extent. So we're talking about policy change, and I think maybe that was the wrong word from my point of view, and I was thinking more on a local level when I was mentioning policy change and businesses adopting policy. Because when we look at the policies, or we look at the legislation, as I've mentioned, the way that they get around that is by being fairly vague. Good handling practices is in the manual handling operations regulations. Doesn't say what they are, doesn't say what they should be, just says good handling.
So you're meaning local guidelines, procedures, that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
it's less mandated, and it's more that we've got positive messages at a level that's not going to be used as a stick to beat people.
Yeah, exactly, and those things are almost easier to change. It's more easy to change them than to change big policy, and I think big policies have been made in that way, so they don't have to fight back in the other direction in 10 years' time when another research paper comes out. All they need to do is change what they define as good handling technique. The wording doesn't need to change, they just need to change what's underneath it, essentially.
Would audit level, some of the evidence-based policy change that would help a factory and a department in something like that, the more local the research, the better.
Yeah.
So of course we can map that onto some of the impartial RCT work, etc. But would you say if there was a well-conducted local audit of practices that were then to be informative of that factory's working practices, is that the sort of thing that you'd be then thinking would be valuable to influence their policy?
I think it's a start, definitely. And I think that's again where we're talking about the evolving role of physiotherapy within every industry that we talk about, and I think one way in occupational health that physios can evolve their role and help out businesses is how to conduct good audit or good research methods in terms of collecting data and looking at that from a health perspective. So I think that's one way in which physios can evolve their role in occupational health, is help with that data gathering so that it's easier to inform local policy on what they should and shouldn't be doing, for example, or what adjustments could be made within the factory to make those things easier. I think it could be done on a local level much better, and I think we can use the likes of the HSE and ROSPA and the ACPO to disseminate the big picture ideas, if you like, on what our general messaging is. I've heard the analogy of a chessboard somewhere recently. I don't know where I heard it, but the rule, the chessboard is finite. You can't change the rules of chess, but within it there's lots of different moves that you can make, and I think the governing bodies or the body's job is to define the rules of the chess game, and then people have the ability with the data that they collect to make whichever moves they feel necessary within their business that's optimal for them. So I think at the moment it's just too fixed. This is the way you do it, this is the way you lift, this is the way you move, and there's no real room for modification of that within current frameworks of thinking.
So that wraps us up. I think we've been on a fair journey there, scrutinising the details of all these bits and pieces. Anywhere, how can everyone find more about you? Where we can get access to your new materials, your new website, for example, and also anything else you want to advocate or suggest that people point to?
Yeah, so Twitter is where most people can find me a lot of the time. So that's Ash James Physio, or at Ash James Physio on Twitter. So it'd be great to interact with anyone who's got any thoughts on anything that I've talked about today. You know, I certainly get a lot out of interacting with people on Twitter and you know, learning from their experiences as well. I have a website, resiliencephysio.com. So that is looking at the idea of resilience, and that's where lots of resources and information about various courses and talks and things are held. And off the back of this, I'm looking to launch a one-day course on managing occupational lower back pain in the near future. So keep your eyes out for that.
Absolutely, and we'll be pointing people in that direction sometime soon, probably with a free course space, which you've not agreed to, but I've just said it on air. So
yeah, it counts. Yeah,
tough luck now. Yeah, no, that's been great, and certainly thank you so much for your time, and we've had a great day thinking through these things. Definitely, there were certain things that might have been bits that we've missed or any faux pas that either of us have stumbled into that we hope our hope our listeners will heckle us on. You can find us on social media, of course, at TPM Podcast. I'm at Jack A. Chew, and we'll be seeing you next month. But I want to leave it to Ash to do our cheesy sign out for our finish. So, do you remember it or?
Give me a second to remember it.
I know, bit good that, wasn't it? Thank you so much to Ash James and to IPRS Health for sorting out this episode and for doing the great work that they do. And it's especially well worth paying attention to the man. As you heard, find him on social media, as you can find us, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. Please drop us a review on iTunes if you get a chance to. Really useful to us, and annoyingly so with the current algorithm. I rarely shill for that over the 52 episodes we've done. Rarely plug it, but kind of they've changed the game a little bit in terms of how we're found, and so it would be worthwhile as letting you guys know a little more how useful that would be. So if you've got a couple of minutes spare, then please do drop us a review and rating on iTunes. That would be handy, or on Stitcher or anything like that. And of course, thank you so much for sharing it, and those of you that share it on your in-service trainings, etc., and give us feedback from them. It's amazing to see the infographics and the note sheets and the clipboard whiteboard type feedback that we get is awesome. So thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. And we've got a really busy month coming up, so please keep an eye on our social media feeds for that under various different hashtags, namely PRS 2018. We're going to be doing a live stream, as I mentioned at the start of the show. And then also we've got the next Big R's event, which is the 20th of April. We're going to be doing live streams for that, a panel on reasoning and a panel on responsibility, followed by open discussions in and around the concept of reform and what we might mean by that and how we might do it. Lots of news coming forward on the social media front for our conference 5th and 6th of October, which is going to be enormous. We've got some great guests that are all lined up for that and soon to be announced. So again, well worth just paying attention to us for the next few weeks, because it's going to get exciting. Flick's going to head over to Pain Cloud Convention over in Norway. That's on the 21st to the 23rd, something like that, which is going to be cool. So we're going to be making plenty of noise in April. That's fair to say. So lots to look forward to, as well as some great episodes coming up on this stream for Physio Matters. We hit quite an exciting milestone actually this week, which was the 50th person to support us on Patreon, which brings it to a 0.2% of our general listenership. Send us a few quid each month on Patreon, which I'm not being sarcastic. I am actually delighted about that. Thanks so much to those that do that. And so to celebrate, I'm going to do a Ask Me Anything podcast, a sort of live stream that we'll do on Facebook and YouTube. So pay attention to that. It's going to come in the next few weeks to celebrate that glorious milestone, taking questions from patrons as well as then to the rest of you on social media. So that's the last little plug from me. I leave you. Ash eventually remembered what he needed to say for the cheesy sign out. So I pass you back over to Ash to sign us out, and thank you once again for listening and for all your support.
You've been listening to the Physio Matters podcast, discussing physio matters because physio matters.